Good morning. This is the Lew Rockwell Show, and it's so great to have as our guest this morning Mr. Roger Stone. Roger Stone is, of course, a legendary political operative for presidents and other important candidates. I think of him most as being associated with Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan, and also his time with Trump, which I want to talk to him a little bit about Trump after we're done talking about Jeb and the Bush crime family. Those of us who've known Roger for a while have always admired his intelligence and his skill, but it's quite something to find out, he had magnificent books in him. And I love these books. Let me name the two previous ones: The Man Who Killed Kennedy, The Case Against LBJ, and then The Clintons' War on Women. Now, of course, this most recent one, Jeb and the Bush crime family. These books are quite extraordinary. They're fact-filled, they're thoroughly documented, and yet they read like a thriller. I mean, they just a tremendous narrative. It's the kind of book you start and you're not going to stop until you finish it. It's not something you'll ever put aside and say, well, I'll look at that next week. So these are riveting books, powerful books. Roger, it's so great that you've gone after. I might just change your subtitle to The Inside Story of an Evil American Dynasty. I mean, these from Prescott Bush through Jeb, and I guess they were hoping George P. was going to be a president too. This is really a terrible bunch of people.
Yeah, they operate like an organized crime family rather than like an American political dynasty. And look, Lou, I spent 40 years in the corrupted rectum of the two-party system. And I was a loyal Republican in the Barry Goldwater mold. I believed in the old Republican Party, the party of small government, individual freedom, party that wanted to keep the government out of your bedroom, out of your business, out of your life. And that Republican Party doesn't exist anymore, thanks largely to the Bushes and others like them. And therefore, the two parties, the Democrats and the Republicans, have morphed into one party. It's the Wall Street Party, the party of endless war, erosion of our civil liberties, massive debt, unsound money. I think it's vitally important that people recognize that there are no philosophical differences whatsoever between the Clintons and the Bushes. These are bookends. These are two crime families who often work together, by the way, to profiteer.
No, and of course everybody was supposed to be surprised that George H.W., the father of Jeb and George W., and Bill Clinton, when Bill Clinton got out of the presidency, became best pals. Well, of course they were best pals, as you say, except I hate to criticize the Mafia. At least the Mafia sort of stuck to their area and supplied services that people actually wanted to buy.
Well, and they had a code of honor, which these people have no code of honor whatsoever. I mean, in all honesty, the Bushes continue to wrap themselves in this notion of integrity and courage and fortitude. I mean, look at the speech by George W. Bush in South Carolina this past Monday. And that is a canard. These are crony capitalists, not by any stretch of the imagination conservatives in any way. In fact, they actually disdain organized conservatism and always has. They're chameleons. So George H.W. Bush ran for the U.S. Senate as a Goldwater Republican, then ran for the House as a moderate Republican, then ran for president as a liberal Republican. He gets selected over my opposition and organizing for vice president. I was working for Ronald Reagan at the time as the regional political director for the northeastern states. And I specifically recall a meeting that was held right after Reagan was nominated on the first ballot in a conference room at the convention headquarters hotel. 16 of my contemporaries of my opposite numbers, so all 16 regional political directors, men and women, around the table. And Ronald Reagan came in to thank each one of us, shake each one of our hands individually, pose for a picture, and then he sat down, and Ed Meese, later to become Attorney General, said, well, I know a number of you would like to tell the governor your thoughts on the vice presidential nomination, so the floor is open. And for the next 45 minutes, George H.W. Bush was eviscerated, as each one of us went around the table and talked about the various dirty tricks that his campaign had tried against us. And by the way, Bush's campaign was mostly old preppies and WASPs and CIA alum who may or may not have still been on the government payroll. And there was not a single voice for George Bush. Then a ballot was taken. 16 people 11 of them for Congressman Jack Kemp from Buffalo, and the other 4 or 5 emotionally for Senator Paul Laxalt of Nevada. Within 48 hours, George H.W. Bush was vice president, or the vice presidential nominee.
I remember being shocked at the time. I was not hugely invested in Ronald Reagan at that point, but I thought if there was any good that was going to come out of his administration, this proved it wouldn't happen.
The sad truth is, and this happens again and again, when we elect an outsider president, and Reagan was an outsider, having gone to New York to organize the state for him, the Wall Street money, the smart Republican money, the established money was either with George Bush or John Connally. There was very little support among the moneyed class, a lot of support at the grassroots for Reagan. But what happens is you get co-opted. When we do, on those rare occasions, elect an outsider president, the establishment immediately convinces him that only we know how to run Washington and we can really help you here. And of course, what happens is that their policies become muted. That's exactly what happened. One of the things I dwell on in the book is the assassination attempt on Ronald Reagan, because Bill O'Reilly's new book, Killing Reagan, misses the entire backstory. What's really happening is a struggle inside the Reagan administration between Secretary of State Al Haig, who has the quaint notion that Reagan's Secretary of State should run foreign policy, and George H.W. Bush, who of course wants to seize the foreign policy mantle for the New World Order. And at the time that Reagan is shot, there are 2 executive orders on his desk, one drafted by Haig, one drafted by Bush, each one authorizing and empowering same. I believe, among other things, that there are 2 shooters in the Reagan assassination attempt. I show you in the book a photograph from Michael Evans, who was Reagan's official photographer. I couldn't get this photo from the government. They wouldn't give it to me. I had to go directly to Evans to get it, because the government's released photo has been carefully cropped. If you see the entire photo that isn't cropped, you can see the second gunman. If you look closely, you can even see the gun in his hand, which explains why the trajectory of the bullets are all incorrect. Hinckley is crouching, yet Reagan is hit from above. So whether this was a warning to Reagan or whether it was a legitimate attempt to kill him, several things are indisputable. John Hinckley Jr. is the son of John Hinckley Sr. John Hinckley Sr. was a major financier of George Bush's 64, 70, and 80 campaigns, and also ran an oil company in Houston that did business with Zapata. Like Zapata, John Hinckley Sr.'s oil company appears to have been a front for the Central Intelligence Agency. So there's just far more to the assassination attempt. Was this an attempt to warn Reagan or to kill him? I'm not really clear. I do know this. Reagan signs the directive giving George H.W. Bush control of foreign policy shortly after the murder attempt.
Wow. And of course, George H.W. Was certainly involved in the murder, not the attempted murder, the actual murder of John F. Kennedy.
Without any question. What adult claims for 30 years that he cannot remember where he was on November 22nd, 1963? George Bush maintained that fiction for 30 years until in the 80s, under the Assassination Review Board record release, 2 documents come to light. One is a memo from J. Edgar Hoover to underlings ordering them to brief George Bush of the CIA on details of the Kennedy assassination. And the other one is a very curious memo written by the bureau chief of the FBI in Houston, who reports for the file that George H.W. Bush called him 7 minutes after Kennedy had been killed to say that he was in Tyler, Texas, and that he had heard from somebody who heard from somebody who heard from somebody that there was a young man named James Parrott, who was a young Republican in Harris County, who may or may not have made threats against the president. And oh, by the way, did I mention that I'm in Tyler, Texas? Anyway, I'll be leaving Tyler, Texas soon. So clearly the purpose of this phone call is to establish an alibi. I don't go any further than that. There are other researchers and authors who do. But why would anybody lie about their presence in Dallas? We know now for an absolute fact that George Bush stayed in the Sheraton Hotel only steps from Dealey Plaza the night before the Kennedy assassination.
This is a bad bunch, and as you point out in the book, it really started with George H.W. Bush's dad, Senator Prescott Bush.
Yeah, of course, I'm from Connecticut originally, so I have a long history of watching and fighting with the Bushes. Prescott Bush was, of course, a partner at Brown Brothers Harriman. He was partners with Roland Harriman, the liberal Democrat son of Averell Harriman. They make the big family money arming the Nazis. Prescott Bush is Hitler's personal banker. He arranged for the financing of the Nazi war machine of the Third Reich. He also owns a very lucrative piece of a steel mill in Germany that utilizes slave labor from Auschwitz. And he's a major financier of a philosophy that was very popular in this country in the 1930s called eugenics. Eugenics holds that the way to clean up the gene pool is to sterilize inferior peoples. Now, what are inferior peoples? Well, they could be black or brown or yellow, or they could be blind or deaf or have a club foot, but this was a very popular upper crust philosophy, and in its milder form, it's known as Planned Parenthood. In its extreme form, of course, it's National Socialism, it's Nazism. This association cost Prescott Bush the Senate seat in 1950, where Drew Pearson, who was the most powerful syndicated columnist of the day, revealed only days before the election in Connecticut that Prescott Bush had been a major financier for Planned Parenthood. In overwhelmingly Catholic Connecticut, that was a downer, and he would lose the seat by a couple of points. Then fast forward to 1952, the man who defeated Prescott Bush, Senator Brian McMahon, dies suddenly, creating a vacancy. It's this year that the other Connecticut Senate seat is up, so both Senate seats are on the ballot in 1952. Eisenhower is at the head of the ticket. The Bushes put enormous pressure on Governor John Davis Lodge, brother of Henry Cabot Lodge, once referred to by Richard Nixon as the smart brother. And Lodge resists appointing Prescott to the Senate, making him run for the open seat. But because it's the Eisenhower sweep, Prescott Bush goes to the U.S. Senate, where he becomes chairman of the Senate Banking Committee, which is a really good trick when you own a controlling interest in a New York bank.
So, I mean, these people have been corrupt from the beginning, but tell us about, the most recent political scion, or maybe not so, maybe we can't even call him politically so bad at it, Jeb Bush. He has a CIA background. He has a drug war background, both in promoting the drug war and profiting from cocaine, and just a bad guy all around. And you have some great stuff to say about why his personality is the way it is, too.
Yeah, I mean, I think Jeb is more like his mother than like his father. I mean, same thing you like about George H.W. Bush. He has this kind of goofy affability and a nice manner. And when you meet him, I think it hides the duplicitous and intensely ambitious nature of George H.W. Bush. But Jeb is more like his mother. Haughty, arrogant, nasty, vindictive, and totally entitled. I'm always amused as I travel around the country and people tell me, well, Jeb's a nice guy. No, Jeb is not a nice guy. Lew, you put your finger on it. He, according to Congressman John LaBoutier and a number of his boarding school intimates that I interviewed for the book, Jeb was the man to see for cocaine and marijuana in boarding school, in college. I also have a report in the book that according to the longtime publisher of the Houston Chronicle and their veteran police reporter, Jeb was arrested in Houston along with John Connolly Jr. And Dudley Farenholt, the son of Sissy Farenholt, a legendary Texas Democrat, for bringing a kilo of cocaine into Houston. Literally overnight, that arrest record completely disappeared. So Jeb is a hypocrite. This is a guy who uses drugs himself, according to his classmates, was perpetually stoned, yet today he favors tougher mandatory penalties for people who use drugs. He is the ultimate drug warrior, supporting more federal funding for the failed war on drugs. There are indications that he was involved in drug trafficking within the context of Iran-Contra. And I think this is probably George H.W. Bush's greatest transgression. He headed a task force as vice president with the approval and support of CIA Director Bill Casey, which imported millions of dollars worth of drugs into the southern United States to convert those drugs to cash to illegally pay for the support for the Nicaraguan Contras after the U.S. Congress cut off federal funding in the Boland Amendment. And at first they tried to traffic those drugs through Texas, but the Texas local officials, the state police and the governor, would not go along. Then they tried to traffic them through Louisiana. And then ultimately they found a southern state with a friendly governor who was more than happy to take his piece and look the other way. That would be William Jefferson Clinton. And as L.D. Brown, who was Clinton's bodyguard and driver, says in his biography, he went out to Mena, Arkansas to poke around to the airport. He uncovered a tarp on the back of a truck, and he saw literally bales of cocaine. The next day, when he was driving the governor, he told the governor what he'd seen, and Clinton said, "Yup, that's Dan Lassiter's deal." Lassiter was a cohort who presumably was collecting Clinton's piece, and he went on to say George Bush knows all about it. So this is the earliest known association of the Bush and Clinton crime families, although I would point out that they have a similar and mutual CIA background. Cord Meyer writes in his book that after Bill Clinton left Oxford, let me be more specific, after he was thrown out of Oxford for raping a 19-year-old named Eileen Wellstone, according to the State Department records and the Oxford records, he spends the summer working for the Central Intelligence Agency spying on anti-war groups, anti-Vietnam War groups in Europe. So the fix was in the 1992 election. As I reveal in the book, Bill Clinton was talking to Ross Perot virtually every day in a pincer move to defeat George W. Bush. Ross Perot had no illusions about being elected president, but in his efforts to locate POWs, in which Perot got frustrated by the inactivity of the federal government, so he hired his own intelligence people and some soldiers of fortune to try to find American POWs in Asia. And what he bumped into was the CIA's drug trade. And when he breathlessly took this information to his fellow Texan and he thought his friend George Bush to tell him what he had learned, according to Tom Luce, who was Ross Perot's personal attorney, the response he got from Bush was a grim smile.
Wow. If we look what's going on in the campaign right now, it looks like Jeb is going nowhere, although I guess with his sorts of connections and his sorts of principles, it's always possible that they'll try to bring him in as a compromise candidate at a rigged convention. So we may not be done with him, but even though he seems to be politically less important than he might have been, he still is a very significant figure. His family is unfortunately still very significant and can do much evil ahead. And tell us why we still need to be concerned about Jeb Bush and all his relatives and all the evil he has been involved in, is involved in now, and who knows what he's capable of in terms of, is he capable of knocking anybody off?
Let's look at the track record. This is a guy who got a $4 million personal taxpayer-financed bailout when Daddy was vice president. Jeb Bush is a man who defrauded a South Florida bank out of $3.85 million, for which the taxpayers picked up the tab, but then Jeb, was allowed to keep the $4 million property that he had used as collateral.
And that's in a day when $4 million was $4 million.
Right. He avoided federal prosecution on a $17 million fraudulent import-export bank loan. He has made literally millions of dollars on Obamacare through his association with a company called Tenet Healthcare. And as I reveal in this book, he's made a fortune on Obama phones because Jeb is the secret partner of the Mexican billionaire Carlos Slim in a company called TrackPhone. Now, just before he became a candidate for president, Jeb transferred his stock ownership to one of his sons so he would not have to report it on the federal forms. Unfortunately for him, the Cuban Republican woman who was the notary public in that stock transfer kept a copy of the documents. And somehow they found their way to me. So Jeb is capable of stealing a hot stove. Now, as to where the candidacy goes from here, I can tell you that my sources on the ground tell me that even though they had a former president of the United States headlining their rally in Columbia on Monday, in order to fill out the crowd, they had to bus in cadets from the Citadel, the highly revered state military academy. So I do think that he's going to run behind his former protege, Marco Rubio. But, Lew, you put your finger right on it. These rules for the Republican National Convention were very severely changed by the Romney people in the brief period in which they had control. The rules are stacked against an outsider candidate. In this case, let's presume it is Donald Trump, who I think will win the primary on Saturday. Rule 40B holds that you must have a majority of the delegates in 8 states in order to have your name be put in nomination. You will recall that this rule was specifically passed to screw our friend Ron Paul, who had 1 delegate and had every right to have his name put in to nomination so those people could vote for him. That's just common courtesy. And then, of course, the Romney people wonder why Ron Paul didn't endorse Mitt Romney. That same rule is still on the books. It's Rule 40B. And there are also 168 super delegates, which is gets a lot more focus in the Democratic Party than the Republican Party. But those are establishment insiders. There are no Trump voters among those voters. So I think the goal of the political establishment at this point, Trump could run the tables in these primaries, winning each one of them, but with a plurality rather than a majority. And if John Kasich, Jeb Bush, Marco Rubio, and Ted Cruz all stay in the race, there's a high probability that Trump gets to Cleveland with the largest single block of delegates, but short of the nomination. And at that point, this nomination could be decided in the back rooms in a brokered convention, and that's the point at which Jeb hopes to emerge. They are experts on the party rules. The Rules Committee for the next convention is stacked or will be stacked with Bush loyalists. And unlike with Ronald Reagan, at a certain point, the establishment threw in the towel, realized they couldn't stop him, and they got on board. That will never happen with Donald Trump. They will fight his nomination right to the bitter end because they know that he is a nationalist. They know that he will never buy their globalist schemes. They know he believes in American sovereignty, in American greatness. And above all, they know you can't buy him. He doesn't need the money. So no special interest, no super PAC, no billionaire, no lobbyist can buy or bully Donald Trump. And the political class in Washington, the lobbyists, the consultants, the insiders, they're wetting their pants over the idea of a Trump presidency.
If this scenario happens, can Trump still at that point run as an independent? Can he get on the ballot and so forth?
Well, he could, theoretically. Look, I learned a long time ago, never pick a fight with a billionaire. He could. On the other hand, even he recognizes that he's strongest as the Republican nominee. And if they steal this nomination from him, that nomination will be worth nothing because millions of people will stay home. Millions of people will refuse to vote Republican. And what's interesting, particularly interesting, is the inroads that Trump could make among traditionally Democratic voters. He is running stronger among white Catholic Democrats than McCain or Romney was ever able to do. He's running stronger among African Americans than McCain or Romney were ever able to perform. He's even running ahead among Hispanics, although I think he has to do some repair work there because I think people who are Hispanic and here legally, they dislike illegal immigration as much as the rest of us.
You know, I remember seeing a report of a poll in Florida where he was leading. He had the most support among Hispanic Republicans.
Yeah, that's a little misleading, of course, because Hispanic Republicans tend to be Cuban, and it's among Puerto Ricans, which is the largest single growing group of Hispanic voters in Florida, and then secondarily Colombians and Venezuelans, that you have to make inroads. But I think the key to that is that Trump must run an aspirational campaign. Trump stands for economic opportunity, prosperity, success for you and your family. He's made himself rich. Now he wants to make you rich and your country rich. I think great inroads can be made there, and there's no cultural barrier. People who would never in a million years think of voting for any other country club stiff Republican would vote for Donald Trump because they recognize that although he's wealthy, he's a regular guy. He doesn't like to hang out at the country club. He's not the toast of Wall Street. In fact, he's disdained on Wall Street. He made his money in real estate, bricks and mortar, and land, not speculating on a manipulated stock market.
Well, Roger Stone, it's just so great to have you as a guest. You're so knowledgeable and articulate, and you're also the greatest dresser in the country. Can I mention that? And of course,
I appreciate that.
That's a great qualification too. I want to urge everybody to read this book. It's a great piece of American history that you'll never hear otherwise. Jeb and the Bush crime family. Also, Roger's book on the man who killed JFK, the case against LBJ, and the Clintons' war on women. These are three great history books, but it's history that just pops off the page at you, although it's thoroughly documented and all the facts are in there that you might need to make an argument and to learn the kind of history that you'll never hear from the establishment. So, Roger, you're now a libertarian, so you're not a Republican anymore, and welcome. What's next for you?
Well, look, Lou, I cannot rule out that, like Ron Paul, like Teddy Roosevelt, I might someday go back to the sentimental party of my roots, but only if there's a fight worth having within that party. I really thought a couple weeks ago this book might be a dead letter. But now with Jeb having a little resurgence, I think it's really important to correct the historical record. One of the top books on the New York bestseller list right now is by this fellow John Meacham. It is the authorized biography of George H.W. Bush. It is a whitewash job. They have airbrushed
the greatest man alive, right?
Yeah, they have airbrushed all of the blemishes, all of the crimes, all of the treachery, all of the greed out of this story. So my book is an antidote to that book, and I'm really glad you enjoyed it.
Oh, it's terrific, and I don't like John Meacham, and I don't like his books, and so it's great for Roger to take down Meacham among his many other achievements. So, Roger, let me just ask you quickly, is there another book in the works?
I'm going to focus on the death of John F. Kennedy, Jr., I have a lot of I have a lot of information from New York political sources that John Kennedy was gearing up to run for the U.S. Senate in a seat that Hillary Clinton wanted. And the federal government's handling of the disappearance of his plane is really extraordinary and is well outside the normal federal guidelines of how these things are done. And I learned that it wasn't until Ted Kennedy called the President of the United States, in this case Bill Clinton, and got him out of bed at 3 o'clock in the morning and said, "Why is no one searching for my nephew? It's been 8 hours since his plane disappeared, and there is no search party." And the President said, according to a Kennedy staffer I interviewed, "Yeah, we'll get right on it." I think there is a high probability that he was murdered for two reasons. One, he hankered for the Senate seat that Hillary wanted for the same reason she wanted it. He wanted to run for president, and the reason he wanted to run for president was to uncover who killed his father. That's next up on my agenda.
Well, tremendous. And Roger, thanks so much for coming on the show. Everybody read his book. Read all three of his books. Take a look at the Stone Zone. If you're on Twitter, the Roger Stone feed is tremendously interesting. Roger, thanks so much, and look forward to having you back to talk about John F. Kennedy Jr.
Lou, many, many thanks.
Bye-bye. Well, thanks so much for listening to the Lew Rockwell Show today. Take a look at all the podcasts. There have been hundreds of them. There's a link on the LRC front page. Thank you.